I need to get started, but please, again, if this is helpful for you or for a friend, my ask is that you share it. Let's start today's presentation of the patriarchs. All right, so we are going to recap what we learned in the previous presentations. We went through chapter 1 through chapter 11. So today, if you're just tuning in, here's what you've missed. We have the creation of the heavens and the earth. We learned that in chapter 1. In chapter 2, we saw the creation of mankind. We have Adam and Eve. In chapter 3, we call it the fall, or the introduction of sin. Now, within chapter 3, verse 15, we have the first good news. It's the first gospel. It's stating, hey, someone is coming to deal with that sin and that serpent problem. See, what we lost at the fall, we lost this eternal life. So we are cursed. But there's good news here in 3:15. The curse of the fall is now replaced by this blessing of salvation, and it's coming from someone. When we don't know who that is yet in the story, that's why we're tracking. Okay, we know someone is coming. Where is this someone coming from? So that kind of begins this genealogy in the Bible. At the end of chapter 11, I hope you've read it, even though it's super boring because it says, and so begat so-and-so who begat so-and-so. But the reason it's there is because we're tracking this person. Where is this person coming from? So we know that Adam and Eve had two sons. We had Cain and Abel. Of course, Cain killed Abel, so Adam and Eve have substitute Seth. Now, the lineage of Christ, or this someone that's coming, can't come from the line of Cain. It has to come from the line of Seth, this righteous bloodline. So we're following the lineage of Seth, which brings us to Noah. If you remember Noah, God instructed Noah to build an ark, and God was going to restart the world with the good that was left. And that was Noah and his 3 sons and their wives. So chapter 11 is that genealogy. You see Noah's 3 sons here, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. We're specifically focusing on the line of Shem because it opens today's story in chapter 12 with our next subject, this gentleman named Abraham. If you recall, chapter 11, at the Tower of Babel, the descendants of Noah were called to repopulate the earth, but they didn't. They actually settled in this area. So it says in chapter 11 that the descendants of Noah were scattered, each to their own language. So this is the descendants of Japheth. They took over this top area. We have the descendants of Ham who took over this area. And then we have, I showed you in the screen earlier, the descendant of Shem, whom Abraham will be coming from, took over this Middle Eastern area. All right, we're starting in chapter 12. So it says that God commands Abraham to leave his country and travel to the land of Canaan. Now, in this land, God promises that one day Abraham's descendants will become a nation. Now, through Abraham and his descendants, the whole earth will be blessed. Let me just paint that picture for you briefly. The goal was that Abraham and his descendants would go into this nation. They would serve this God. This God will bless this nation, and surrounding nations will want to serve that God to receive those blessings. That's the point. That's the goal. So naturally, Abraham hears this and he's like, okay, I'm just going to go to this promised land. So Abram and his wife show great faith and they travel into this promised land. If you remember in the slide I had just shown you where descendants had gone, we had descendants of Japheth who took over this top area. We had descendants of Ham who took over this area, and then the descendants of Shem took over this area. And that is why Abraham was placed here, and he's called to travel into this promised land, and he settles here in Shechem. And as you can see, his travel or his route was along the water, as you would. This is that Mesopotamia, that Fertile Crescent area. He can't go through the desert. It probably wouldn't be a safe trip for him. So you're traveling through water. Most people did that during their travels in history. The route that Abraham took basically was from Iraq into Israel. Israel in the Bible is called Canaan at this time. So we're going to highlight this verse. If you remember, I'm going to have you highlight things in your Bible as we go through the Bible story. This is called the promise to Abraham, or the Abrahamic Covenant. And I'll go ahead and read it. It says, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great. And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed." All right, so now they're in this promised land, and Abraham and his wife Sarah are unable to conceive their own child. Now, Abraham was just promised that his descendants would become a nation, but his wife's unable to conceive. Now, you can imagine how confusing this must have been for each of them, and frustrating. So Sarah, Abraham's wife, suggests this common practice of surrogacy. She says, "Why don't you have relations with the maidservant?" Okay, think about this. Abraham, you can see as a faithful man of God, his wife can't conceive. So, with his wife's approval as a form of surrogacy, he has relations with the maidservant. She says, "Hey, why don't you have relations? We can't have a kid. Here's a woman that can have a kid on our behalf," right? I'm going to read this verse, Genesis 16, verse 3. It says, "Sarah, his wife, took her slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife." So it's Sarah that gave to her husband. Let's pause and think about Adam and Eve. Eve gave to her husband this fruit, and it presented a problem. And here we are, I'm picking up on notes here, and I hope you guys are too. Here, Sarah gave to her husband this maidservant. It's going to present a problem, and I'll get to that shortly. Abraham goes ahead and follows these instructions, and he has relations with the maidservant. They conceive a child. Now, mind you, God has a timing and a place for everything. This is why we have to be patient on God's timing, not ours. So God says to Abraham that he's actually going to have a son with his wife, Sarah. And Abraham literally fell on his face and laughed. I don't know if that's a laughter of disbelief or laughter of joy. And the reason there's laughter is because he's 100 years old at this point. And God says the same thing to Sarah. Hey, you'll conceive a child. And she's in disbelief too. She's old. And so, mind you, God's promise was fulfilled because God has a timing. And Isaac was born to Sarah and Abraham. Now, this is kind of what I'm alluding to, the problem that's going to present. Who would Abraham recognize as the heir? Is it Ishmael, the firstborn, technically, with the maidservant, or is it the son that God said that he would give to Sarah, Isaac, in verse 17, or in chapter 17, verse 16? Now, I truly believe that Abraham saw Ishmael equally, not just a child of the maid. I believe Abraham loved Ishmael equally, but there is a choice that Abraham must make on who's going to receive the family blessings, this promised land. Who's the heir? Ishmael or Isaac? It's basically asking him to pick a favorite child, and who can really do that? Besides my mom, who obviously picked me as her favorite daughter. And I can say that because I'm actually her only daughter. So Sarah says to Abraham, "Why don't you get rid of Hagar and Ishmael? There's no need for Ishmael anymore. Throw the baby out with the bathwater." And God's like, "Whoa, guys." God intervenes and says, "Hey, I'm going to make it easy on everyone." God states, "I will bless him." We're talking about Ishmael. "He shall become the father of princes, and I will make him a great nation." But God does go on to say and affirm, "As for Isaac, I will establish my covenant with him." So God is making this decision on who he will establish a promise with. And it's Isaac, the son of Abraham, the son of Sarah. This is the problem that I was alluding to, that I was showing you. It's actually a modern day problem. This is the split in the road with religion. The Bible continues its story through Isaac, which eventually we get the nation of Israel, while in Islam scripture, the Quran follows the lineage of Ishmael. And the nation that Ishmael grows into is the Arab nation, Arabian nation. Now, God did fulfill both of his promises to Ishmael and to Isaac, but today you can see the tensions between Islam and Judeo-Christianity. If Sarah would have been just a little more patient, would we even have this modern day problem? Again, God's timing, waiting on his timing and not ours. I'm also going to address polygamy at this time. It's not just in the Bible, it's just what you did if you were a tribe in this time. Say you owned a farm. You needed to produce enough children to harvest the farm, to help till and reap the fields. Also, it wasn't cheap to have multiple wives. You had to pay the bride's father. So really the amount of wives was dependent on your financial means. The amount of children, as you can imagine, there was a lot of child disease at this time with childbirth. So tribes would have multiple wives to produce the amount of children necessary for the farm. So just kind of keep that in mind. When it comes to Abraham's situation, it seemed that he was wanting to preserve the family name. Sarah's unable to conceive, and there's no child to carry on the family name. And so, with his wife's approval as a form of surrogacy, and I say form of surrogacy because I can't imagine they had turkey basters, but as a form of surrogacy, he takes for himself this other woman to carry on that family name. So that's to kind of help you understand where we're at in the Bible story and with what's going on at this time. Right. Genesis 22, we are cruising along. It says, God commands Abraham to take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah, sacrifice him there as a burnt offering. Now imagine how confusing this must have been for Abraham. He's told that he's to become an ancestor of a multitude of nations, but Ishmael's been sent away with Hagar, and at this point, his only son left, Isaac, is supposed to be offered as a sacrifice. Abraham, you can see his continual faith. Not only did he leave his land to go to the land that God called him to, he had to have enough faith that God would provide him with a son with his wife Sarah. So Abraham in this moment sets out to do again what God asks. Abraham and Isaac travel to Mount Moriah. Now, when they get to their destination, Isaac notices that there's no animal to sacrifice. And Abraham reassures his son, God will provide. Think of the faith of both Abraham and Isaac. Abraham's blind faith that somehow God will provide, and then Isaac submitting to the will of his father. It then says that Abraham ties up Isaac and lays him down on top of the wood, and Abraham raises his hand to kill his son. And fortunately, the Lord intervenes and says, hey, do not lay a hand on the boy. I'm going to back up just a moment, though. If you didn't catch this, in chapter 22, verse 2, it doesn't necessarily say, slay your son. It says, prepare him, offer him as a sacrifice. So just catch that note. Anyway, so Abraham goes to slay his son, and the Lord intervenes, and the Lord provides the sacrifice. It was a ram, if you read the story. So Isaac's life was saved because God provided this other life, this sacrifice. And think about that. This is the first time the Bible mentions a life for a life. And that has a deep meaning because it does parallel the coming of Jesus. God providing a life, a sacrifice for our life, for my life, for your life. Again, God providing a life for a life. I'm going to read the book of Hebrews It's in the New Testament, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 17. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, "It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned." Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead. And that means something to both you and I. Do you believe that Jesus was raised? Abraham's had so much faith that he believed, even if I do this, I have enough faith that God would raise my son. That's how much faith Abraham has. And that's the question I want to ask you. Do you believe in the resurrection? Do you believe that Jesus was raised? Because this Bible story has always pointed to Jesus. And here it is. You can see Isaac carrying the wood for his sacrifice, Jesus carrying the cross. And Mount Moriah, where Abraham offered Isaac, is in Jerusalem. We know Jesus was offered as a sacrifice in Jerusalem. All of these signs are pointing to Christ. Take your only son. And if you haven't heard this message, I want to share it with you today. It's in the New Testament. It's John 3:16. It says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. For God did not send the Son into the world to judge the world, but that the world might be saved through him." You believe, you'll be saved. Here we go. That promise to Abraham that all families of the earth will be blessed. Here it is, ultimately fulfilled by Christ, what Christ did for us, so we could be saved through him. God's perfect salvation plan. I just love Abraham's faith, his obedience, his trust, his loyalty in God. I could only ask to have all of those things. I ask that of you guys, to have so much faith. Read this story and believe just as much as Abraham believed, and you will be saved. Genesis chapter 24, we're going to finish the life of Isaac here. We know that Abraham's blessings and promises from God are passed down to Isaac. It says that Isaac married Rebekah and she conceived twins. We have Esau and Jacob. Now, Esau is the first to come out, so technically he's the firstborn, or should get the family inheritance. He's the heir. But he sold his birthright for a bowl of soup. So when it was time for Isaac to pass the blessings down, Esau didn't want to give his birthright away, even though he had already committed verbally. So he and Jacob had this dispute over this family birthright. And ultimately, Isaac blessed Jacob, which means that God's covenant and God's blessings are now transferred over to Jacob. I personally don't feel sorry for Esau. He initially gave his birthright up for a bowl of soup. I mean, what kind of leader would he have been if he's willing to give it all up? He's thinking about the here and now and not the future. And that's something that we can all take. There's decisions that are happening today that affect us in the future. So it's important to make godly decisions. So this ends the story of Isaac. We now know that blessings and promises are given to Jacob. So we're going to follow the life of Jacob. All right, we have Jacob, son of Isaac, grandson of Abraham. Now, blessings and covenants are passed down to Jacob from his father Isaac. Now, because of his dispute with his brother Esau, Jacob has to leave town and go to his uncle's house. Now, while at his uncle's house, he falls in love, and he trades 7 years of labor for his wife. So it's a true labor of love. Now, Jacob and his wife cannot conceive. If you're taking a snack break, this is the perfect time to get popcorn, because it says in Genesis chapter 30 that Rachel's sister Leah has multiple children with Jacob. She birthed 6 sons and 1 daughter. In chapter 29, verse 30, it says, Jacob loved Rachel, but she was barren. Now, Leah's trying to win this affection from Jacob. She even says in one verse, my husband will be more attached to me because I have gave him 3 sons. So Leah's trying to win this affection. And then she even went as far to give her maidservant to Jacob. And they had 2 sons. Now Rachel starts to become a little jelly, a little jealous of her sister who's birthing all these kids for Jacob, and the maid's having children too. It's kind of funny when it's an interesting note when you're looking at the sibling rivalry that Jacob was fighting with his older brother Esau over this like family birthright, and in this story Rachel is fighting her older sister, the sibling rivalry over the firstborn. Anyway, going forward with the story, Rachel's still unable to conceive, so she says, okay, well, I'm going to give my maidservant to Jacob, and she does, and the maidservant and Jacob have 2 sons. Guys, God has a timing, and his timing we have to be patient on, because Rachel finally does conceive and she has 2 sons. So we have Joseph and Benjamin. Ultimately, Joseph is going to be the heir. He's going to be the firstborn, the son that Jacob had with his beloved wife, Rachel. A lot going on. So we have Leah. This is Rachel's sister. This is her children that she had with Jacob. We have Leah's servant that had 2 children. We have Rachel's servant that had 2, and ultimately we have Rachel, Jacob's beloved wife, whom they had 2 children. We have Joseph and Benjamin. We are in Genesis chapter 32. It says that God changes Jacob's name to Israel, and that can translate to who wrestles with God. Now, God affirms that his promises will be fulfilled through Israel and his descendants. So I'm going to read this verse. It says, God said to him, your name is Jacob. You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel shall be your name. Now a nation and a company of nations shall come from you, and kings shall come forth from you. The land which I gave to Abraham and Isaac, I will give it to you, and I will give the land to your descendants after you. So I put it in bold in chapter 35, verse 12, the land I will give it to you. So here the Bible states that the land, the promised land, will be named after Israel. So now we are in, I'm no longer going to call him Jacob, I'm going to reference him as his name, Israel. And it says that Israel loved his son Joseph. As you know, Joseph is the firstborn that Israel had with his beloved wife Rachel. In Genesis 37, we read that Israel loved his son, and Joseph is this dreamer, and he has a dream that one day the sun, the moon, and 11 stars will bow down to him. Well, that's a strange dream if you ask me, but what he's suggesting is that one day his brothers will bow down to him. Now, as you can imagine, he told his brothers this dream, and they weren't amused. When Joseph told his brothers, they became jealous. They hated Joseph. They hated the affection that Joseph was getting from their father Israel, and the fact that Joseph is technically one of the younger brothers, but has the audacity to say that he's going to rule over them. So the brothers plot to kill Joseph. Ultimately, they come to an agreement to sell Joseph, and they sell Joseph to traders passing through. Joseph at that time was 17 years old when he was taken into Egypt. So he was taken from the promised land, from the land of Canaan, into Egypt. Now, the brothers had to lie and cover up this story. So what they say to Israel, their father, is that what they did was they took Joseph's clothing, his tunic, and they covered it in blood from a goat that they had slaughtered. And they lied to Israel, telling him, hey, this is Joseph's clothes. He must have died from a wild beast. And they show Israel, their father, this tunic, these clothes, as proof that Joseph had died. Okay, so while in Egypt, we know Joseph is sold as a slave. He's now in Egypt, but he's a slave to an officer of the Pharaoh, an officer to the king of Egypt. Now, while enslaved in Egypt, he's interpreting dreams for 2 of his cellmates. Now, it says that the Pharaoh had this reoccurring dream for 2 years that no one could interpret, not the magicians, not the wise men. And the Pharaoh hears of Joseph in his dream interpretation and calls for Joseph. But Joseph makes it clear to Pharaoh that, hey, it's God who is providing him with divine wisdom. So Joseph's being very humble here. He's saying, hey, it's God who is revealing the meaning behind these dreams. So Pharaoh tells his dream to Joseph, and Joseph interprets it. And the Pharaoh responds, since God has informed you of all of this, there is no one as wise as you are. So Pharaoh understands that God is with Joseph. So Pharaoh gives Joseph authority in Egypt. So Joseph is no longer a slave. He's actually in a position of power. He becomes a ruler in Egypt. Now, while in this position of power in Egypt, over the next 7 years, Joseph stores large portions of harvest. So if there were a famine were to occur, people from surrounding areas would go to Egypt to buy food, and that's exactly what happens. There's a famine present in the Promised Land, in Canaan. So Israel sends the 10 sons to travel into Egypt in search of food. So here's where the story gets kind of fun. Joseph recognizes his brothers, but they don't recognize him. Remember, the last time that they had seen Joseph, Joseph was 17 years old. By now, 20 years have passed. So Joseph's probably like 37 years old. So as a sign of respect, the brothers bow down to this ruler of Egypt. They bow down to Joseph. Well, this is full circle because at 17 years old, Joseph said to his brothers, one day you'll bow down to me. That produced so much hate and jealousy from his brothers that they sold him as a slave. They would never think that he would be ruler of Egypt. And here they are bowing down to him, and they don't even know it. And Joseph starts to question him. He's like, hey, how many brothers do you have? And they say, well, we are a family of 12, but one is at home in Canaan and with our father, Israel. So it shows, hey, Israel's still alive. And the other brother has died. The other brother that they're talking about is Joseph. He's staring right at him like, really, guys? So Joseph makes a deal with him. He says, why don't you go back to Canaan and bring your other brother, bring Benjamin. He wants to be with all of his brothers in this moment. So Joseph asks them to go back to the land of Canaan and bring their little brother Benjamin. Now, for the first time in front of his 11 brothers, they're united for the first time, but they still don't know that they're standing before Joseph. And Joseph ultimately weeps loudly and discloses himself. He says, I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. Can you imagine? Their mouth dropped, like completely speechless. But Joseph, look at his heart here. He forgives his brothers. He says, do not be sad or angry with yourselves. God sent me before you to help you. So he's saying good came from evil because of what they did. What they did was evil, but God had a plan all along. Because of what they did, Joseph's now in this position of power to help his brothers. He's able to feed his family. He's in the Pharaoh's court. So Joseph says, you know what? Pack up all the family, including our father Israel, and let's move into Egypt, into the land of Goshen. Let's move into this land. So the brothers and their families and their father Israel move into Egypt. So we're wrapping up the end of the story. Now, while in Egypt, Israel blesses the 12 sons. So the various blessings here are not only to the 12 sons, but also these blessings will be transferred to the 12 tribes. So these 12 sons are now going to develop into 12 tribes. And here's our next clue. This is a fun part for me. In chapter 49, verse 10, it says, the scepter will not depart from Judah. What does that mean? You're probably looking at me. Well, what it's saying is we know that there's a serpent crusher that was coming. That happened in Genesis 3:15. And here's another clue. it's coming from the line of Judah. We learned that in Genesis chapter 49:10. The scepter will not depart from Judah. So now we need to start following the line of Judah and find out where this someone is coming from. So in chapter 49, verse 33, it says Israel died, and then in chapter 50, we end the book with Joseph dying. So that ends this book of Genesis. For closing, the book of Genesis, creation of the heavens and the earth, creation of mankind. We have the fall. Now, the curse of the fall is replaced by the blessings of salvation, and we know someone is coming to deal with that sin, that serpent. And so we have our next clue is we know that that person is going to come from the line of Judah. So that begins this genealogy in the Bible. We know that the descendants of Abraham will grow into a nation. Ultimately, that's where we're following Abraham's descendants. We're following that nation, specifically following the line of Judah, to see where these blessings to all will come from. All right, so these are things you can highlight to help you in your studies. We have chapter 1, verse 27, that man is made in the image of God. We know that someone is coming in 3:15. We know it's coming from Abraham. His descendants will become a nation, and the significance that all the families of the earth will be blessed, it's pointing to Christ, and we know that whoever this someone is, which ultimately is Christ, but whoever this someone is, up until this point, we don't know that it's Christ yet. But whoever this someone is coming from the line of Judah. So that is the story of the book of Genesis so far. The message that you can learn from it is it explains our world. It explains humanity, how we came as a people, and ultimately it explains God's timepiece, the nation of Israel. The direct message that you can take from it is that we are made in the image of God. Basically, it's saying we have an origin, we have a purpose, and we have a destiny. This is just something fun. Keys to remembering the book of Genesis. Genesis is the book of the big N-ins. The big N. Yeah, okay, I'm just playing with you guys. All right, so our next presentation is the book of Exodus. I'm excited to share this with you. We know that the Israelites are now in Egypt, so let's see what happens next.